Tyrese Haliburton thought he had a chance to convince LeBron James to join the Pacers. Instead, LeBron's response left him getting laughed at before the conversation even got started. Now, Haliburton is revealing exactly what happened. Let me break it down. Let's set the scene, because the timing here is what makes this sting. LeBron James had just walked away from the Los Angeles Lakers after 8 seasons, officially entering free agency for the first time in years with no obvious landing spot locked in. Around that same window, about a month before James made his decision to leave the Lakers, Haliburton picked up his phone and sent a text trying to get James to come play in Indiana. This wasn't some rando reaching out. Haliburton and James know each other. They stood on the same podium together, teammates on the 2024 USA basketball team that won the gold medal in the Olympics. So when Haliburton reached out, this wasn't a stranger cold calling a legend. This was one guy texting a guy he'd actually won gold with. The response he got back, James typed out 2 laughing, crying face emojis. That's it. No, let me think about it. No, I'll call you. No, appreciate the offer, brother. Just the emoji equivalent of a shrug and a laugh. And then nothing else. Haliburton said it himself. He texted me back 2 laughing, crying faces, and that's all I got, he said. And from there, the pursuit was over. In Haliburton's own words, he decided right then that he was done chasing James in free agency, adding that he genuinely didn't know if it was ever going to happen in Indiana. Now, where did all of this come out? Not in a leaked text screenshot, not through some anonymous source. Haliburton told this story himself, live, in front of an audience, sitting right next to James. The two of them were at Fanatics Fest in New York, where Haliburton had been brought in as a special guest host on James's own podcast, Mind the Game. Think about that setup for a second. The guy who got clowned by 2 emojis is now sitting shoulder to shoulder with the guy who sent them, live on a stage in front of cameras and a crowd. And Haliburton just told everyone what happened in real time, with James sitting right there. James didn't deny it. He didn't soften it. According to Haliburton's own account, James quickly dismissed the idea of joining the Pacers. And that dismissal is what effectively closed the book on any Indiana pitch before it ever really opened. Haliburton wasn't shy about it either. By his own admission, that response was enough for him to shut down his recruiting efforts entirely and move on. Here's what makes the moment land so hard. On paper, Haliburton wasn't recruiting from a position of weakness. Yes, the Pacers had just finished with the 2nd worst record in the entire NBA. But rewind 1 season before that, and this same core group of players had done something almost nobody expected. They'd reached the NBA Finals, pushing the Oklahoma City Thunder to 7 games. This wasn't some tanking franchise begging for relevance. This was a team that had been 1 win away from a title just 12 months earlier, texting the king and getting laughed off before he'd even packed his bags from LA. So naturally, the reaction across the basketball world was instant. Writers covering the story didn't hold back on how blunt the whole exchange looked. One outlet flat out called it James being petty toward Haliburton over the recruitment attempt, framing the 2 emoji reply as a dismissal. James didn't need to hand out the way he did. Another framed it as James simply not taking the offer seriously at all, noting that Haliburton did not press the matter any further once he got that response, which again tells you everything about how final that reply felt in the moment. Then there's the league itself, which had been buzzing about this exact scenario before Haliburton even opened his mouth about it. In the days leading up to the Fanatics Fest show, a league source pushed back hard on any idea that Indiana was seriously in the mix at all, telling one reporter flatly that the answer to whether the Pacers would even attempt a real recruitment was a flat-out no. That same source went further, insisting that James is still very much a superstar, that people shouldn't try to downplay it, and that he's still the guy who wants the ball in winning time. So even before the text got revealed publicly, people around the league were already predicting exactly how this would go. That James wasn't seriously entertaining Indiana as a destination, no matter who was doing the asking. And that's really the shape of this story so far. A superstar with a gold medal and a 5-year max extension reached out, in good faith, to a friend he'd won championships and Olympic gold alongside. He got 2 emojis back. He stopped texting. And then he told the world about it himself with a laugh, sitting right next to the guy who sent them. Because at that point, what else was there to do? But this wasn't just a private text exchange that leaked. It happened on a stage, in front of an audience, as part of a much bigger back and forth between the 2 of them that got even more pointed once the mics were actually on. Here's where it gets even more interesting. because the emoji story wasn't even the only moment of the night where James put Haliburton in his place. The two of them were doing a live recording of Mind the Game together, and Haliburton, sitting in the co-host chair usually occupied by Steve Nash, clearly saw an opening. This was his shot to get James to reveal on the spot, in front of a packed house, exactly where he was signing. He took it almost immediately. According to ESPN's Dave McMenamin, Haliburton attempted to ask James about his decision early in the show, but LeBron quickly shut the conversation down. Not a dodge, not a joke, a shutdown. James wasn't playing along with the bit, and he made that clear right out of the gate. There's an exchange that got passed around widely afterward, captured by NBA reporter Mike Vorkunov. Haliburton asked James point blank if he had a decision to announce for everyone. James's response was short. He told Haliburton they just talked about this in the back, meaning backstage, before the show even started. Haliburton didn't push. He just said okay, he'd leave it alone, and the podcast taping moved on like nothing happened. But Haliburton wasn't done. Later in the same show, right before it wrapped, he tried one more time. With a grin on his face, he turned to James and asked again if there was finally a decision to share. And then before James could even open his mouth to answer, Haliburton cut himself off, laughed, and said he was kidding, that there was no decision. The crowd reportedly erupted at that moment. It was a bit a tease, but it was also Haliburton once again trying to squeeze information out of a guy who had already told him, twice now, that the answer wasn't coming. James, for his part, added one more line after the whole recruiting story got brought up on stage. A comment about how people have already seen everything coming out regarding his free agency, essentially confirming that yes, the reports swirling about his other options are the real ones to pay attention to, which, if you think about it, was its own quiet way of putting a stamp on the whole Pacers conversation. He wasn't confirming Cleveland or Miami or Philadelphia by name in that moment, but he was making it clear that whatever noise existed elsewhere was the noise worth tracking, not anything involving Indiana. Now, let's bring in a third voice here, because this wasn't just a two-man show. Former Pacer Victor Oladipo, who's been around this franchise and this locker room culture for years, has talked about how Indiana tends to operate during moments exactly like this one. Oladipo's read on the Pacers' style is that they work quietly out of the spotlight, and people sleep on them until suddenly they look up and see a fully built team in front of them. He's pointed to the front office, Kevin Pritchard, Chad Buchanan, the ownership group, as the ones who consistently pull that off. It's a viewpoint that frames the whole Haliburton pitch less as a desperate plea, and more as a franchise quietly trying to add one more piece behind the scenes, the same way they've built everything else. And that's part of what makes James's reaction land the way it did. Because from a league insider perspective, sources have made clear the Pacers organization itself wasn't rolling out some grand recruitment plan. A team source described it plainly, that it would be great to have James, sure, but that the Pacers don't need him, not with the young core already on the roster, because they're busy trying to build their own identity rather than chase a super team headline. That same source confirmed Haliburton would sit in on a meeting if the front office ever called one, but stressed it would purely be out of respect for James, not because Indiana was making any kind of real push. So you had three distinct signals all pointing the same direction, all before James even said a word publicly about his intentions. Haliburton, texting on his own personal initiative, trying to make something happen. The Pacers organization, standing at arm's length, not actively chasing it. And James himself responding to the personal attempt with two emojis, and on stage with a flat redirect every time the subject came up again. Three different angles, all landing on the same conclusion before the free agency dust had even settled. What's wild is how public all of it became. This wasn't a private locker room story that slipped out months later in a memoir. This was Haliburton, mic in hand, telling the story to a live crowd with James sitting right next to him, and James letting the story stand without correcting a single detail of it. He didn't jump in to say it wasn't that bad, or I actually thought about it. He let two emojis and a shutdown speak for themselves. And that raises the obvious question everyone in the building, and everyone watching clips of it afterward, wanted answered. If Haliburton's pitch was this quickly and this thoroughly waved off, what exactly was he even offering? Because on paper, next season's Pacers roster isn't nothing. There was an actual pitch buried in that text, even if James never gave it more than a laugh. To really get why this stung the way it did, you have to understand what Haliburton was pitching James on in the first place. because this wasn't a bottom feeder trying to punch above its weight with a Hail Mary text. This was a roster with real, recent finals pedigree, trying to add one more star to push it over the top. Go back one season. Haliburton and this same Pacers core made a run that surprised almost everyone outside the locker room, riding buzzer beaters and full team chemistry all the way to a 7-game NBA Finals against Oklahoma City. That's the version of the Pacers Haliburton was selling James on, not the rebuilding, injury-ravaged group that finished with one of the league's worst records the following year, but the identity and habits that got them within a game of a title. And here's the part that makes the pitch even more specific. Haliburton wasn't just offering himself, he was offering a lineup. Reports floating around the recruitment framed exactly what that hypothetical roster could have looked like. James lining up alongside Haliburton, Pascal Siakam, and center Ivica Zubac. On paper, that's a legitimate playoff core, a facilitator in Haliburton, a two-way scorer in Siakam, size and rim protection in Zubac, and James slotting in as the headliner tying it all together. It's the kind of fantasy roster that gets people saying it would have been fun to watch. Fun enough that plenty of fans openly admitted they'd have to settle for building it in a video game instead. There's also a development angle to this pitch that rarely gets talked about. Behind the scenes, Indiana's coaching staff has reportedly spent real time working with Zubac to extend his range out toward the three-point line, trying to marry his physical low-post game with a modern pick-and-pop style. The goal is to open up driving lanes for Haliburton once he's back to full health. That's not a small, cosmetic tweak. That's a franchise actively retooling its offensive infrastructure around the exact point guard who was, at the same time, trying to talk James into joining it. But here's the complication that made the pitch land at the worst possible time. Haliburton wasn't in a position to sell himself as a healthy, available running mate. He'd spent the entire season rehabbing a torn Achilles, an injury that happened in the cruelest way imaginable. Early in the first quarter of Game 7 of the Finals, the exact game that would have crowned a champion, he went down, needed help off the floor, and watched the rest of that title game from the locker room. The recovery that followed wasn't simple either. Along the way, he dealt with a bout of shingles that cost him weeks away from the team, made him gain weight, and even cost him part of an eyebrow. This wasn't a guy texting James from a position of full health and momentum. He was texting from the middle of a long, grinding rehab, hoping to convince a two-time Finals MVP hunting for a ring to bet on a roster that, for that entire season, didn't even have its franchise player on the floor. So when you put it all together, a Finals run that was 1 year old but felt fresher, a real roster with actual pieces, a coaching staff actively building infrastructure around a healthier future, and Haliburton himself grinding through a brutal recovery timeline, it's a more serious pitch than two emojis would suggest. This wasn't nothing. It just happened to arrive at a moment when Haliburton had almost nothing tangible to point to beyond potential and memory. And that gap between what the Pacers actually had to offer on paper and what they could prove in the moment might be exactly why the front office itself never turned this into a real, organized recruitment. Remember, a Pacers source made clear the organization wasn't chasing James in any coordinated way, insisting the team didn't need him given the youth already in place. That's a franchise choosing to build patiently rather than gamble everything. On a 40-something former MVP walking into a locker room that had just finished with one of the worst records in franchise history. Which brings us to the other side of this whole equation. Because while Haliburton was floating a fantasy lineup built on last year's Finals run, James and his camp were working an entirely different board. A literal one, and it didn't have Indiana's name written on it anywhere at all. While Haliburton's text was getting laughed off with two emojis, James's actual free agency process was unfolding somewhere completely different, on a literal whiteboard, laid out by his longtime agent, Rich Paul. And when that board got revealed publicly, it made the Pacers' absence from the conversation even more obvious. Paul appeared on his own podcast, Game Over, and physically walked through a list of teams James was considering, using a whiteboard and a pointer, like he was breaking down game film. The list included the Cleveland Cavaliers, Miami Heat, Philadelphia 76ers, Golden State Warriors, Minnesota Timberwolves, Denver Nuggets, New York Knicks, Dallas Mavericks, Boston Celtics, and San Antonio Spurs. 10 teams. Indiana wasn't one of them. Paul didn't stop at just naming teams either. He went deep into the actual mechanics of James's decision, talking about specific front office relationships like Philadelphia's Jameer Nelson and Mike Gansey, both of whom have personal history with James going back years, or Cleveland's Brandon Weems, who Paul described as basically being like a brother to James. He even brought up Denver's ownership, name-checking his own closeness with the Kroenke family as a factor in whether the Nuggets were realistic. This wasn't vague speculation. This was an agent mapping out relationships, history, and fit at a level of detail that made it clear James's actual shortlist was built on years of connections Indiana simply didn't have. And Paul was candid about how fluid all of it was. He told ESPN that he'd spoken to 27 different teams about James at that point, far more than the 10 on the board, and that the calculus was shifting practically by the day, pointing specifically to how Philadelphia's decision to trade for Jaylen Brown reshuffled the entire picture overnight. That's the environment. James's free agency was actually playing out in real trades, real front office maneuvering, dozens of teams calling in, agents cross-referencing relationships built over a 20-plus year career. Not a text message and a laughing emoji. Multiple reports converged on the idea that 3 franchises had separated themselves as true frontrunners: Cleveland, Miami, and Golden State, with Philadelphia lingering just behind as a real but secondary option tied to its front office ties. Cleveland, in particular, kept surfacing as the name to watch, with insiders pointing to James's history with the franchise, his 2016 championship run there, and Paul's own fingerprints on that original homecoming back in 2014. Paul has been open about the role he played convincing James to return to Cleveland after Miami, framing it as a case of recognizing talent already in place and believing it could be built into a champion, a blueprint that reporters kept circling back to as they tried to guess where this new decision was heading. There were even softer, symbolic signals stacking up around the same time. James spending part of the summer with old Cavaliers teammates from that 2016 title run, and a photo surfacing of him with former high school teammates that included Weems, the same front office connection Paul had specifically highlighted. None of that proves anything on its own, but stacked next to the whiteboard and the 2017 phone calls, it painted a picture of a process that was intricate, relationship-driven, and entirely centered on a handful of franchises that had nothing to do with Indiana. Paul himself later downplayed how seriously the whiteboard should even be read, saying afterward that he hadn't expected it to become the spectacle it did, and that neither he nor James were treating the moment as seriously as the internet ran with it. He framed it as more of a transparency exercise, a way to pull back the curtain for fans on the layers that go into a decision like this, from offensive schemes to defensive ratings, to which front office executives James actually trusts. So when you line the two stories up side by side, the contrast writes itself. On one hand, you've got a 5-year max point guard sending a personal, heartfelt text to a friend he'd won gold with, offering him a finals-tested roster, and a coaching staff actively building around him. On the other, you've got an agent with a whiteboard, 27 phone calls, decades-deep front office relationships, and a 10-team shortlist that never once included Indiana's name. Haliburton was working off friendship and recent history. James's camp was working off pure infrastructure. And when those two processes collided, the whiteboard won without Indiana ever getting a real look. That imbalance is exactly why the two emojis felt so final. It wasn't just James blowing off one guy's text. It was James's entire operation already moving in a direction that had nothing to do with the Pacers at all. Whiteboard and phone calls and all. So where does all of this actually leave things? Because the story doesn't just end with a couple of emojis and a whiteboard. Both of these guys are walking into the next chapter of their careers, carrying very different versions of this moment. For Haliburton, the recruitment attempt is now a very public footnote, sitting on top of a much bigger comeback story. He's been rehabbing that torn Achilles for months, tracking a recovery timeline that's actually run ahead of schedule. By the time he posted footage of himself dunking again, it had been roughly 5 months since the injury, well ahead of the typical 8 to 10 month recovery window doctors usually give for that kind of tear. He's talked openly about leaning on fellow injured stars during the process, including regular check-ins with Boston's Jason Tatum, who went through a strikingly similar injury around the same time. Both of them have been trading notes, week by week, on what it actually takes to come back from something that ends most players' explosiveness for good. There's also a quieter, more human thread running through Haliburton's rehab that rarely makes the highlight reels. The fact that he spent much of the lost season rehabbing right alongside Indiana Fever star Caitlin Clark, another franchise player working through her own injury nightmare at the same practice facility. Two of the most important names in their respective leagues grinding through parallel comebacks, in the same building on the same timeline. That's the version of Haliburton that existed behind the scenes while the emoji story was going viral out front. Not a guy sulking over a rejected text, but a guy quietly stacking small wins in a boot, one benchmark at a time, while trying to get back to the level that made his recruiting pitch worth sending in the first place. And that's really what makes the whole exchange land the way it does. Haliburton wasn't just some fan of James shooting his shot for clout. He was a max contract all-star, an Olympic gold medalist standing next to James on that same podium, a guy who'd led his team to Game 7 of the finals, reaching out in good faith to someone he considered a friend. He got two emojis back, and instead of burying that story, he stood on a stage next to the very man who sent them, and told the world about it himself, laughing along with it rather than letting it sting in private. For James, the moment fits into a much larger pattern that's defined his entire free agency process. This is a guy whose agent needed an actual whiteboard to keep track of every team interested, who fielded calls from nearly 30 franchises, who spent weeks feeding the rumor mill with cryptic podcast appearances and viral photos with old teammates. Against that backdrop, a friendly recruiting text from Indiana was never going to be treated as a real contender for his signature. Not because there's anything wrong with the Pacers, but because James's actual decision was always going to be shaped by decades of relationships, front office ties, and championship calculus that Indiana simply wasn't part of. What's left then isn't a rivalry or a grudge. It's a friendship that survived a joke landing exactly the way jokes do, between people who trust each other enough to let it be public. Haliburton clearly wasn't offended enough to let the moment die quietly. He brought it up himself on a stage, with James sitting a few feet away, and let the two of them laugh through it together in front of a crowd that ate up every second of it. And James let it stand, without ever needing to clarify or soften what those two emojis actually meant. Meanwhile, the two of them are still headed toward the same season from very different directions. James beginning his 24th year somewhere on that 10-team board, chasing one more shot at a title with a roster built by an agent's whiteboard and years of relationship building. And Haliburton heading back into a Pacers uniform after a year on the sideline, rebuilding not just his Achilles, but the case for why this franchise deserves to be taken seriously again, with or without a superstar who laughed off his last invitation. The recruiting pitch didn't work, but it also didn't need to end anything. If anything, it's just one more chapter in a friendship that's clearly built to survive being roasted on a live podcast stage in front of thousands of people. Emojis, whiteboard, and all. Sources: LeBron James's funny reaction to Tyrese Haliburton recruiting him to Pacers in free agency revealed. Bleacher Report. Tyrese Haliburton reveals LeBron James' response to his Pacers recruitment. Yahoo Sports. Rich Paul pulls out the whiteboard as LeBron's free agency heats up. The Roanoke Star. Agent: LeBron eyeing host of teams, including Heat, Cavs, 76ers, ESPN. Tyrese Haliburton struggles with shingles on top of Achilles tendon recovery, NBA.com. Tyrese Haliburton taking the small wins as Achilles tendon rehab continues, NBA.com. Pacers Tyrese Haliburton shares stunning Achilles injury recovery update.